A former cop, broken by the system, becomes a private investigator to help the forgotten. But when he crosses paths with a woman running from her past, their lives unravel into a truth neither of them is ready to face. The rain poured relentlessly, turning the city streets into shimmering veins of water. Maria adjusted her coat, pulling it tighter around herself as her shoes splashed through shallow puddles. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the storm itself carried a warning. She had always enjoyed walking home after a long day at the school, but tonight felt different, wrong somehow. Her footsteps echoed off the brick walls, louder than usual, or perhaps she was just imagining it. She glanced back over her shoulder for the third time. The street behind her was empty, save for the dancing shadows cast by flickering lampposts. Still, a gnawing feeling rooted itself in her chest. I'm being followed. Maria quickened her pace, the soft patter of rain on her umbrella masking the sound of her own steps. She turned the corner onto her street, nearly stumbling as her foot slid on the slick pavement. Her breath caught, and she forced herself to stay calm. Her apartment building loomed ahead, its entrance dimly lit. She hurried up the steps, fumbling with her keys. Finally, she was inside. The thick door closed with a reassuring thud. Maria stood in the narrow hallway, breathing heavily. The dripping water from her coat formed a small pool on the floor. Get it together, she muttered, wiping her face with trembling hands. She approached her apartment door and froze. A small folded piece of paper lay on the doormat, drenched from the rain. Her heart thudded painfully as she bent down and picked it up. Ink had bled across the page, but the message remained legible. "We're watching you." Maria's fingers tightened around the paper. Her eyes darted up and down the hallway, but it was empty. The old fluorescent light buzzed softly above, its pale glow doing little to ease her panic. "Who?" she whispered, though there was no one to answer. She backed into her apartment and slammed the door shut, locking it. The silence of her small living room felt oppressive, the shadows in the corners more pronounced than ever. Her hands shook as she dropped the paper on the table and grabbed her phone. A dull ache pounded behind her eyes, but she ignored it. She dialed the local police station, barely managing to explain her situation to the officer who picked up. "Please, I think I'm being followed. I found a note. Someone is watching me," she said, her voice cracking. The officer's response was indifferent. "Ma'am, we can't file a report unless there's been a clear threat or crime. It's probably just a prank." "A prank? You think this is funny?" Her frustration bubbled to the surface, but the line clicked dead before she could say more. Maria dropped the phone onto the table, a bitter taste filling her mouth. "Fine. If they won't help me, I'll go there myself." Minutes later, she stepped into the harsh fluorescent light of the small police station. The room smelled of old coffee and stale air. Officers bustled about, indifferent to her presence, until she approached the counter. A young officer named James stood behind it. His eyes, sharp and observant, met hers. "Can I help you?" Maria held up the note with trembling hands. "Someone's following me. They left this." James's brow furrowed as he took the note, studying it closely. "And no one else is helping you?" She shook her head, relief flooding her chest when he didn't dismiss her concerns. For a moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up, his tone steady. "I'll see what I can do." Something in his voice, a hint of determination, gave Maria a sliver of hope. James sat on the edge of Maria's worn-out sofa, his hands clasped so tightly that the veins in his knuckles strained against pale skin. The dim light of the old lamp carved deep shadows across his face, making his expression seem distant, almost ghostly. Maria sat across from him, quiet but attentive, her heart tight with unspoken questions. "I don't usually talk about this," James began, his voice uneven, raw like an old wound reopening. He paused, staring at the floor as though the words were buried somewhere beneath it. "My sister. Her name was Lily." Maria's throat tightened. She watched as James exhaled, his shoulders falling slightly. She was only 16, smart, bright, full of dreams. His voice trembled, but he pushed through. "She was everything to me." He hesitated, fingers curling tighter as though steadying himself. One night she didn't come home. 2 days later they found her, alone, cold. He swallowed hard, the word lifeless lingering unsaid but deafening between them. Maria felt the room shift, colder, heavier, as if the air itself carried his pain. "It wasn't just the crime," James continued, anger breaking through his grief. "It was the police. They called it bad luck. Said it was just the wrong place, wrong time. No real investigation, no answers. They gave up on her, Maria, like she didn't matter. His jaw clenched, his voice low and tight. I couldn't save her, but I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again, not to anyone. Maria's heart ached at the weight of his words. For the first time, she truly understood him, a man fighting against the ghosts of his failure. James looked up, meeting her eyes. That's why I keep going, why I can't stop. The silence between them grew heavier, stretching too far. Maria stood abruptly, needing to move. I need water, she muttered, walking toward the kitchen. The room felt suffocating. She reached for a glass, her fingers pausing mid-air. A photograph lay on the counter, perfectly placed. Maria's stomach dropped. The image showed her by the window in her room, looking outside. It was unmistakably her, same shirt, same time of day. But the angle was wrong. The shot was taken from inside the house. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. James, she called softly, her voice strained and paper-thin. James's head snapped up at the sound. What is it? Wordlessly, Maria turned the photograph toward him. Her face had gone pale, her pulse drumming in her ears. Someone's been in my house. James was on his feet instantly, crossing the room in 2 quick steps. His sharp gaze flicked over the photo before narrowing. This isn't random, he said, voice low and urgent. Whoever's behind this, they're close. The walls felt smaller now, closing in. Maria's breath caught in her throat as her fingers gripped the photograph. We're not safe, she whispered, the words barely audible. James nodded grimly, scanning the darkened room as though expecting someone to step out of the shadows. Maria returned home just as the first shadows of evening crept through the windows, bathing the living room in dim light. The silence, usually a small comfort after a long day, now carried an eerie weight. She paused at the threshold, her keys trembling in her hand. Something felt off. The front door was locked as she'd left it. Yet as Maria stepped inside, she felt her chest tighten. The faintest shift in the air, a subtle disturbance she couldn't place, made her hairs rise. Moving cautiously through the house, she turned on lights, her breaths quickening. In the living room, the first sign appeared. A framed photo of her parents was no longer on the mantel but face down on the coffee table. Maria froze, dread washing over her. Her stomach churned as she moved toward the kitchen. Drawers once closed were ajar. A mug sat conspicuously at the center of the table, though she'd never placed one there. She spun around, scanning for any presence, but the house was still, terrifyingly still. Upstairs, her bedroom delivered the final blow. Her bedside lamp flickered faintly as her gaze landed on the bed. An old stuffed bear, one she hadn't seen in years, rested in the center of her pillow. Maria staggered backward, covering her mouth. Tears burned her eyes. Whoever it was, they had been here, inside her space, close enough to dig through her memories. A cruel message embedded in every displaced object. I know you. An hour later, she sat curled in her living room, phone trembling in her hand. I can't take this anymore, she whispered when James picked up. Please help me. James arrived swiftly. He moved through the house with focused precision, his sharp eyes cataloging every detail. Maria watched from the couch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her mind spinning with questions. After checking each room, James sat across from her. It's no longer just intimidation, he said grimly. This, he gestured around, is a message. Whoever's doing this wants you to feel vulnerable, watched. It's calculated. Maria wiped her tear-streaked cheeks. Why me? What have I done? James didn't answer immediately, his expression unreadable as he inspected the upturned photo. You haven't done anything. This is about power, control. The next morning, James began his unofficial investigation. He combed through every corner of the house, taking notes. His discoveries unsettled him further. The intruder had been meticulous, entering and leaving without a trace of forced entry. The choice of items, personal, emotional, suggested an intimate understanding of Maria's life. Whoever this is, they know you well, he told her later, holding the stuffed bear. Maria sat silently, the weight of it sinking in. James met her gaze, his voice steady. I'll protect you, but we need to find them before this escalates further. For the first time, Maria nodded. She couldn't fight this alone anymore. Maria glanced at James from across the dimly lit street. His silhouette was tense, shoulders squared as he scanned the apartment building. This is a bad idea, she whispered, her voice firm but quiet enough not to draw attention. James shot her a sharp look. "We're losing time, Maria. If we wait for a warrant, this lead might disappear." His tone carried both frustration and resolve, but Maria saw something else in his expression, impatience that bordered on recklessness. She sighed and adjusted her jacket, her fingers nervously brushing over the badge clipped to her belt. "We're officers of the law, James. There are rules for a reason. And sometimes rules don't catch killers," he retorted, already moving toward the building's side entrance. Maria hesitated, watching him disappear into the shadows. The air was cool, thick with the damp scent of rain-soaked concrete. Her instincts told her to stop him, call for backup, follow the protocol they'd sworn to uphold. But her curiosity, and perhaps the faintest sliver of doubt, kept her rooted in place. The building itself loomed like a forgotten relic, its cracked brickwork and dim corridors oozing neglect. James slipped through the door with an efficiency that hinted at too much practice. Maria reluctantly followed, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet beneath them. Inside, the silence was oppressive. The faint hum of a flickering light bulb overhead accompanied their careful advance. James paused outside a door labeled 4B, his fingers grazing the rusted knob. He glanced back at Maria, his eyes dark in the faint glow. "Stay sharp." Maria's unease twisted tighter as he pushed the door open without hesitation. The apartment was suffocating. Stale air, piles of newspapers stacked like tombstones, the faint reek of something metallic lingering in the corners. James moved with an urgency she'd never seen before, rifling through drawers, overturning papers, as though every second counted. "This is breaking and entering," Maria said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We can't use anything we find here. You know that." James didn't stop. "This isn't about the system. It's about answers." Her eyes darted around the room, a broken window, a blood-stained shirt peeking out from under a mattress. Maria froze. "James!" He turned just as she lifted the edge of the bed. Beneath it, tucked away in a shoebox, sat a collection of photographs, each one carefully marked with dates and initials. Some of the faces she recognized, missing persons, others unknown but all chilling in their quiet despair. "Bingo," James muttered, grabbing the box. "Stop!" Maria stepped between him and the door, her heart pounding. "You're crossing a line, James. This isn't how we do things." James stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe it's not how you do things." His words hung heavy between them, and for the first time Maria felt a chill deeper than fear, a sliver of doubt that cut through her resolve. Whose side was James really on? James paced the worn wooden floor of his apartment, a pile of notes scattered across the table in front of him. The name Miguel glared back at him from the center of the mess, hastily underlined. It had been days of fruitless searching, but now fragments of Miguel's true identity began to surface like a sinister specter from beneath dark waters. A name on a list, an overheard conversation, a carefully placed bribe. James's gut had whispered about connections, ones that stretched far beyond the shadows of alleys. His contact in the police had reluctantly hinted at Miguel's ties to Victor Rivas, the city's most sought-after defense lawyer, known for getting even the worst offenders acquitted. Then there was Samuel Moreno, the well-dressed businessman with an iron grip on local real estate, known as much for his charm as his underhanded dealings. Together, these were names that moved like puppeteers in the city's upper echelons, wielding power with invisible strings. "They protect him," James muttered, his hands bracing the sides of the table. The realization was a weight in his chest. Miguel was no petty criminal. He was a man insulated by influence, untouchable in plain sight. Elsewhere in the city, the late afternoon sun poured golden light over a small park. Children's laughter echoed faintly, and couples lounged on wooden benches. Amid this idyllic setting, Maria sat alone under a sprawling oak tree, her book open but forgotten in her lap. She had been restless since the incident days before, her eyes often drifting to scan the area without her realizing. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The voice came gently, seemingly polite, but Maria's spine stiffened. She looked up, and there stood Miguel, a slender man in a clean gray suit that fit him too well, his expression a blend of practiced concern and warmth. Maria's heart pounded, her instincts warning her. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice steady, though her fingers trembled slightly against the book. Miguel smiled, his teeth perfectly aligned. Not officially, he said. But I've been around. Sometimes people cross paths in the most unexpected ways, don't they? Maria stood, gathering her belongings quickly. I'm sorry. I have somewhere to be. Miguel stepped back, raising his hands as if to say he meant no harm. His posture and tone betrayed nothing threatening, yet there was something about his ease, about his presence, that unsettled her more than an outright threat ever could. Forgive me, he added smoothly. I didn't mean to bother you. You just seemed troubled. Thought you could use a friend. Leave me alone, Maria said firmly, turning away. She walked briskly toward the busier section of the park, casting a quick glance over her shoulder. Miguel stood rooted where she left him, his figure blending too well into the crowd. To any passerby, he looked harmless, a friendly stranger sharing a polite exchange. But Maria knew better. His tone, his words, they felt like tendrils of a trap slowly curling around her. That evening, James slammed the receiver of his landline into its base. His latest call had ended with another dead end. No one wants to talk, he murmured, exasperated. Miguel's connections were already clouding any path forward. But as he sat back, Maria's name flashed through his mind. Unknowingly, they were circling the same storm. The small room reeked of damp air and desperation. Miguel sat tied to an old wooden chair, his wrists bound so tightly the ropes had carved into his skin. James paced back and forth like a caged predator, his breathing heavy, fists clenching and unclenching. The flickering light bulb overhead swung gently, casting jagged shadows across the room. You know why we're here, James growled, his voice a low rumble. Confess. Miguel, bruised and disheveled, managed to scoff. You're no better than me, James, tying me up like some criminal. What does this make you, huh? The words struck James harder than any physical blow. His jaw tightened, muscles in his neck flexing as his rage surged. He turned on Miguel, grabbing the back of the chair and pulling it forward violently, their faces inches apart. Don't you dare compare us, James spat. You stole everything from her. You destroyed lives and you think you'll walk free? Miguel smirked despite the pain. You're fooling yourself if you think this makes you a hero. James froze. The thin line between justice and revenge trembled beneath his feet like an unstable bridge. He wanted to hit Miguel, to make him pay. But a voice deep inside whispered that if he crossed that line, there would be no going back. His heart pounded, sweat dripping from his brow. The door suddenly burst open and James spun around. Maria stood there, her eyes wide with disbelief, hands trembling at her sides. What are you doing? She demanded, her voice cracking. James faltered, the fury draining slightly from his face. Maria, You kidnapped him? Her gaze shifted from James to Miguel, then back. James, no. This isn't who you are. James stepped toward her, his hands open, pleading. Maria, you don't understand. This man, he ruined everything. I'm trying to make it right. Tears welled in Maria's eyes as she shook her head. And what will this accomplish? You think tying him up and yelling at him will bring justice? Or will it just turn you into the same kind of monster he is? I'm nothing like him, James shouted, his voice raw. Look at yourself. Maria's words cut through him like a blade. Look at what you're doing. The room fell silent except for Miguel's ragged breathing. James turned slowly toward his captive, his hands trembling at his sides. Miguel's smug expression had faded, replaced with caution. James felt his pulse in his ears, a deep drumbeat of rage and doubt. For a moment, he saw his reflection in the grimy window, dark, twisted, unfamiliar. Maria stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Please, James, don't lose yourself to this. We can't fix the past like this. James blinked, his vision clearing. The tension in his body loosened as Maria's words anchored him. His fingers relaxed. He took a step back from Miguel, breathing deeply, trying to calm the storm raging inside. Miguel smirked again, sensing the shift. You're weak, James. That's why you'll never win. James turned to Maria, pain in his eyes. Get out of here, Maria. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice fragile. He didn't answer. For the first time, James had no idea. James sat on the edge of the worn chair in the small, dimly lit office. The flickering fluorescent light buzzed above, casting shadows across the room that felt as heavy as the news he'd just received. Across the desk, his superior, Mr. Hayes, leaned back with a sigh, his stern expression unwavering. James, this is out of my hands, Hayes said finally. You've been suspended, effective immediately. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. On what grounds? James asked, his voice strained, though he already knew the answer. Hayes slid a manila envelope across the table. An anonymous report, detailed too. You've been accused of using excessive force and overstepping boundaries on your recent cases. James's jaw clenched as he grabbed the envelope, glancing at its contents. His encounters with Miguel's men had grown increasingly violent. He'd told himself it was necessary, justified, but someone had been watching, and now he was paying the price. Hayes, James started, his tone pleading. This isn't just some case, Miguel's network. I don't want to hear it. Hayes stood, signaling the conversation was over. Turn in your badge and gun. James stiffened but complied, setting the items on the desk with a soft clatter. He left the office without another word, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Outside, the cold air cut through his jacket like shards of glass, and he exhaled, his breath fogging in front of him. Maria watched James from the kitchen window as he parked his car. The usual determination in his steps was replaced by something else. Defeat. Her grip on the edge of the counter tightened as she turned away, heart pounding. She had seen the change in him lately, the anger in his eyes, the violence in his actions. He'd promised to protect her, but at what cost? The front door creaked open. James entered, his expression dark. You heard? He asked. Maria nodded, her voice soft but firm. They called me this morning about your suspension. James looked at her, searching for understanding, but her gaze was cautious, distant. I can't stop now, he said, pacing the living room. Suspension or not, Miguel has to be stopped. And what will it take, James? Maria's voice trembled. You're scaring me. It's not just Miguel anymore. It's you. James froze, her words piercing through his growing frustration. He turned to face her, but she was already backing away. She no longer saw him as her savior, but as a man slipping into dangerous territory. I'll fix this, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Maria didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her coat and left the room, the door clicking softly behind her. The city skyline was ablaze with neon lights as James sat alone in his car later that night, staring at his phone. He had spent years on the right side of the law, but desperation gnawed at him now. A folder of Miguel's operations sat on the passenger seat, names, locations, evidence he had collected through questionable means. It was enough to blow Miguel's network wide open. James opened his email and began typing. He hesitated only briefly before hitting send, attaching the sensitive files to the local newspaper editor. Let's see how you like the spotlight, Miguel, he muttered under his breath. As the message confirmation flashed on the screen, James leaned back, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. There would be consequences, bitter ones, but he was past caring. If the law wouldn't stop Miguel, the truth might. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the storm James had just unleashed. Miguel sat alone in his dimly lit office, his jaw clenched tight as the television blared yet another news broadcast. Images of files, testimonies, and damning evidence flashed across the screen. Maria's face appeared next, her calm yet determined expression sending a chill through him. It was all over the city. Whispers had turned into roars. Local businessman Miguel Rodriguez faces serious allegations after leaked evidence links him to corruption and coercion. Miguel slammed his fist on the table, sending a glass of whiskey crashing to the ground. The sound echoed in the silence of his sanctuary, now a prison. He couldn't breathe. It was the first time the walls felt like they were closing in on him. The network he had carefully woven for years was unraveling thread by thread. He pulled out his phone, his shaking fingers dialing a number. It rang and rang. No answer. The allies who once jumped at his call now treated him like a plague. Growling under his breath, Miguel grabbed his coat and stepped outside. If they wouldn't answer, he'd deal with this himself. Maria was in her small office, sipping cold coffee as she reviewed the latest reports. Her tired eyes scanned the pages, every word a symbol of victory. But relief hadn't yet come. Her instincts whispered that Miguel wouldn't bow quietly. As if summoned, her phone buzzed, a blocked number. She hesitated before answering. I hope you're proud of yourself, Maria, Miguel's voice hissed, low and venomous. You think this changes anything? You think they'll thank you for tearing me down? You'll be nothing when this is over. Maria exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. It's already over, Miguel. A chilling silence followed before the line went dead. She placed the phone on the desk, forcing her hands to steady. Outside her window, a murmur of activity stirred on the street. People were talking, neighbors, workers, students, all carrying fragments of the truth she had exposed. Miguel's intimidation had faltered against something bigger, the weight of public scrutiny. Moments later, blue and red lights lit up the evening gloom. A convoy of police cars screeched to a halt in front of Miguel's mansion. Officers emerged, their faces stern with purpose. Miguel watched from the window, his heart hammering. He'd expected time, a window to escape or negotiate. Instead, the system, finally unshackled by fear, was closing in. He rushed to the back door, stumbling through his garden in a desperate bid for freedom. But as he turned the corner, he froze. A group of officers blocked his path. One step forward, handcuffs glinting under the fading sun. "Miguel Rodriguez, you are under arrest." The words struck like a hammer, shattering his last illusion of control. The officer read his rights while Miguel's shoulders sagged. From across the street, Maria watched quietly as cameras captured every moment. The crowd grew, whispers now a roar of vindication. For the first time, Miguel's name no longer commanded power. It carried disgrace. Maria turned away, a small smile on her lips. It was over. The soft hum of morning seeped through the cracked blinds, casting slanted beams of light across the small apartment. Maria stood by the window, her fingers trembling as they traced the steam rising from her cup of tea. Outside, life continued as if nothing had happened. The distant honk of cars, hurried footsteps on the pavement, the faint laughter of children. But inside her, everything had changed. The scar on her temple still ached, though the wound had long since begun to close. She often caught herself reaching up to touch it, as if to remind herself that the nightmare was over. It was over. At least that's what she kept telling herself. The faint creak of the door drew her attention. James entered the room, his tired frame silhouetted by the hallway light. His movements were slower now, his shoulders slumped in a way they never had been before. The fight had left its mark, not only on his body but on his spirit. He looked at Maria, his gaze softening, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "How are you feeling today?" he finally asked, his voice low, careful, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm between them. Maria managed a weak smile. "Better." She hesitated, looking down at the tea in her hands. "Trying to be better." James nodded and sank into the chair opposite her, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He'd heard those words before. He'd said them himself countless times over the years. Trying. It was always about trying, never about succeeding. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes drifting toward the distant skyline beyond the window. "It's not your fault, you know," Maria said softly, watching him. "What happened? You couldn't have stopped it." James's jaw tightened, the words pressing against him like a weight he couldn't shake. "Maybe," he murmured, "but it doesn't feel that way." He thought back to the chaos of that final confrontation, the shouts, the gunfire, the decisions made in fractions of a second. His instincts had kept Maria alive, but the aftermath, that was something he couldn't control. His badge, once a symbol of purpose, now felt heavier than ever. Whispers in the department, the bureaucratic aftermath of his actions, they had taken their toll. "I knew there'd be consequences," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't know how much it would cost." Maria set her cup down and leaned forward, her expression steady. "James, you saved me. You don't have to carry the rest." James met her gaze, seeing something in her eyes that anchored him, a fragile kind of strength that she was beginning to reclaim. It reminded him of why he'd fought so hard, and for the first time in days, the tightness in his chest loosened just a little. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything unsaid filling the room. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than it should have been. "I'm thinking of going back to work," Maria said suddenly, breaking the quiet. James looked up, startled. "Not right away, but soon. I need to feel normal again." James smiled faintly. "Normal's overrated." Maria laughed softly, the sound surprising even her. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small reminder that healing, no matter how slow, was still possible. As the day stretched on, James found himself standing by the door, keys in hand, ready to leave. He turned back to Maria, who sat at the table, a book open in front of her. The light streaming through the window cast her in soft hues, and for the first time since the ordeal, she looked calm. "You're safe now," he said quietly, almost to himself. Maria looked up and gave him a small nod. And you'll be okay too, James. He lingered for a moment, letting her words sink in, before stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind him. The sound echoed faintly through the building. Outside, the city was as restless as ever, but James felt different somehow. He adjusted his coat, feeling the chill of the air against his skin, and walked toward his car. His career might never recover, his reputation forever scarred, but there was a strange sense of relief in knowing he had done the right thing, the only thing. As he drove off, Maria watched from the window, the scar on her temple catching the light. The fight had left marks on them both, but scars, she thought, weren't just reminders of pain. They were proof that survival was possible. The early morning sun bathed the city in soft amber light, filtering through the thin clouds like threads of gold. James leaned against the edge of his worn wooden desk, the faint creak of the floor beneath him breaking the silence of his small office. His gaze wandered to the window, where the hustle of a new day began outside. Cars rumbled down the streets, pedestrians bustled with purpose, and the distant sound of a train's horn echoed across the city. On his desk lay an open case file, an ordinary folder that, for him, represented a promise to himself. After everything he had endured, James had chosen to keep moving forward. Becoming a private investigator hadn't been an obvious path, but it had been the right one. Unlike his years as part of a broken system, this work allowed him to focus on those left unheard, the people the law had overlooked, forgotten, or failed. He reached for his coffee cup, still half full and lukewarm, as the door creaked open. A timid woman stepped inside, clutching her handbag. Her face was drawn with worry, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Crawford?" she asked softly. James offered a faint, reassuring smile. "That's me. Please come in, have a seat." The woman sat, glancing around the sparse office. It was far from luxurious, but the space carried a quiet integrity, much like James himself. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice as she began to explain her story. James listened, his sharp yet weary eyes fixed on her, taking in every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He simply listened. As the woman spoke, James's mind wandered briefly. He remembered where he had been just months ago, drowning in loss, pain, and betrayal. Now, here he was, grounded by a renewed purpose. There was no erasing the past, but he could shape what lay ahead. Meanwhile, miles away, Maria stood on the balcony of her small apartment, the wind lifting strands of her dark hair as she gazed at the horizon. The sky stretched wide and boundless, a canvas of gentle blues and whites. Birds soared above the rooftops, their wings outstretched, free. Her new home was humble, tucked in a quieter part of the city. The streets were cleaner here, and the distant sound of children laughing in the nearby park filled her with an unexpected warmth. She wrapped her arms around herself, inhaling deeply as a faint smile tugged at her lips. Maria had started over. It hadn't been easy. She still woke some nights with shadows of old fears clawing at her chest. But with time, she'd found pieces of herself she thought had been lost forever. She had begun working at a small community center, helping women who, like her, had once been trapped in dark places. Every day was a step forward, a small triumph against what once held her down. She thought of James, the man who had become part of her story, and silently wished him well. They hadn't spoken much since parting ways, but she knew he was out there, just as she was, walking a path forged through hardship. Maria looked to the sky one last time, then turned back inside, closing the balcony door behind her. In his office, James stood as the woman finished her story, wiping a tear from her cheek. He walked to the window, staring out at the sunlit streets as the city hummed with life. The scars of the past would remain, etched deep into his soul, but they no longer defined him. James turned back to the woman, his voice calm and steady. "Don't worry, I'll help you." For the first time, her expression softened, a flicker of hope lighting her eyes. As James shook her hand, he thought of all the stories yet to come, all the people who needed someone to stand up for them, to listen. He wasn't a hero, but he knew now that every action, no matter how small, mattered. The day outside grew brighter. James grabbed his coat, stepped out of his office and into the bustling world, ready for whatever came next. Each step forward felt lighter, leaving the past behind and opening space for new chapters. one still waiting to be written. Sometimes life pushes us into dark corners where the only way out is through courage and the will to rebuild. James and Maria's journey reminds us that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying our scars with purpose, using them to shape a better future. But what about you? If you were faced with their choices, to stand up for the forgotten, to leave behind a painful past, would you have the strength to move forward? Click the video on the screen to continue your own journey of reflection and self-discovery. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss stories that challenge, inspire, and make you think. Thank you for being with us today. See you in the next